Jackie, he, him from Mississippi.
All right.
And Jackie wants to talk about Kurt Gödel's ontological argument for the existence of God. Hi, Jackie. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. How about you guys?
I'm doing great. I'm doing great.
Thanks for calling. So tell us about it.
So basically, Kurt Gödel was a mathematician and logician who's pretty popular amongst some people, and he basically formulated an ontological argument for a variation of the ontological argument, trying to prove the existence of God. And that's basically what I'd like to discuss today. And maybe if you see any flaws in it, we could talk about it.
Yeah, so give us your best summary of what they say. Give us your best summary of their general overall idea.
You still with us, Jackie?
Am I breaking up?
Oh, there we go. Okay, you're back.
You're back with us.
Yeah. So
give us a summary of Kurt Gödel's ontological argument.
Okay, if I keep breaking up, I might have to come back a little bit later. Okay. A property A is positive only if its negation A is not positive. If premise 2, if A is not positive, or if A is positive and A entails B, then B is positive. Having an essential property is all and only the positive property is positive. Necessary.
Wait, can you? I'm trying to jot this down here. So could you slow that down just a little bit?
Okay. Premise 1, a property A is positive only if its negation is not positive. If A is positive and A entails B, then B is positive. Having as essential properties all and only the positive properties is positive. Necessary existence is positive. And
let me ask you this. Let me ask you this. In your own words, what do you glean from this? In your own words, what does this mean in terms of the existence of God? How does this prove the existence of God? If you think it does.
Well, basically, if God's defined as a necessarily existing being, then if that property can exist, it entails that God does exist.
So, and correct me if I'm wrong, this sounds to me like another argument in the same vein as because one side cannot prove theirs to be true, that must mean that the other side exists. That must mean that the other side is true. Correct me if I'm wrong. But how does that prove the existence of God?
Well, if God, if existence is part of the definition of God, so God would necessarily have to be a necessary existing being. And if God is a possible being, then God would have to exist in the actual world. Or if it can exist, or to use the modal ontological, if it can exist in some possible worlds, it must exist in all possible worlds.
But see, that's, I think, where we disagree, is that just because somebody comes up with a definition that says something exists, that does not mean that it exists. Just because I say, like our last call, for example, say, for example, I say magic exists. In the definition of the word magic, I am going to include the word exist to prove that it is real. That doesn't mean anything. We can invent definitions all day, every day for things that we want to convince people exist. And so, in my opinion, that this theory does not prove the existence of anything. It might help this person in their own belief and their need to believe that God is real. But if you're asking how we feel about this theory or how we feel about this idea, I do not, it does not prove the existence of God to me. I have never seen any evidence of God. I've never seen anything that suggests that because A, B must be God. So I think it's an interesting thought, but it doesn't do anything for me to prove anything. I can go off all day and say, because I want this thing to be real, I'm going to put the term exists in the definition, and therefore that proves it exists, which it doesn't. So I hope that I'm being clear enough. Rob Boss, feel free to jump in here.
Sure. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Sydney, but are you saying something along the lines of the properties of an object don't affect reality unless that thing exists? Do you think that will kind of go along with what you're saying?
I'm saying it sounds like this theory is suggesting that that God exists because he or they have existence in their definition, in their overall. And to me, that doesn't mean anything.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Like, you can invent definitions all day long, but just because the dictionary tells me something exists does not mean that thing exists.
Right. So if we can show that the thing exists, then its properties can come to bear on reality. Yeah, I agree with that. I want to also ask Jackie a question. It sounded like you were using the multiple worlds semantics in there. Am I mistaken? You said something about if God exists in one possible world, then it must exist in other possible worlds.
Yeah. So one of the rules of modal logic is that if a necessary being or something which necessarily exists possible, it must exist actually.
Okay. So I'm also assuming that there's an earlier premise that says God might exist, right? And so so you're saying if we agree that God might exist, then since God is defined as being necessary, then if it might exist, it will really exist. Right. Is that kind of your argument?
Yes.
So so again, we're using the multiple world semantics here. So what might exist, what that means in these semantics is that it exists in at least one possible world, right? And are you on the same page with me so far?
Yeah, it's
okay. So when you suggest God might exist, you need to show that this God exists in one possible world. You can't equivocate. You can't use a colloquial meaning for might and then switch to the multiple world semantics. William Lane Craig does this too, and it just drives me nuts. He equivocates right in the middle of the argument. You try to sneak in God maybe exists or God might exist, appealing to our nature as skeptics, as trying to be open-minded, as having a discussion here. You use that, you try to sneak it in. You say God might exist unless you can prove that God doesn't exist, right? But then you switch definitions of might, right? Then you switch to those multiple world semantics, and then you let that do the heavy lifting. And so I want to hear your argument. How do you know that this necessary being exists in at least one possible world?
Because it's not logically contradictory, meaning it's possible for there to be a world which has it. It isn't an internal contradiction.
But it is logically contradicting. If you were to say, perhaps God exists in a different world, I would say, interesting. Tell me more about it. But what you're saying is, because there's a chance God might exist in a different world, that means he does, and that's where you lose me. That's like saying, on a different plane, somebody could have committed this crime. On a different plane, somebody, my ex didn't break up with me. We're still together. And that's not reality. That's not true. Especially because we don't even have evidence of other planes. That would be another thing. If we discovered one day that there were 5 planes to the universe and people started coming up with arguments that maybe these things exist on other planes, even that would make a little bit more sense. But to come and say, because there's a chance it might exist, it does, is, in my opinion, is just untrue, unprovable, I'm trying to think of like a better word, for lack of a better term, doesn't make any sense, and it can't possibly be true unless there is evidence of several things. One, other planes. We don't even know that those exist. So how can we say that just because something is an idea that might potentially exist, it exists on another plane that we don't even know is real? there's meta arguments there, right? But also that doesn't mean anything. That we could say these things all day and still be wrong, right? Just because this thing might potentially exist, that means it does. Just because this thing might be true, that means it is. In that case, it's potential that there is no God. Therefore, there is no God. Therefore, atheists are correct. Do you see how that argument also supports my side of the argument? I say because there's a potential plane in which God doesn't exist, that means he doesn't exist.
I see. So are you saying do you reject modal realism?
If that is the definition of modal realism, then yes. If that's the definition we're using, if that's the example we're using, then absolutely. It just doesn't hold up.
She didn't even change context from your question. And so if you think that she's abandoning some philosophical approach that you're not, that's not the case. She was just using the same reasoning you were using. You said that since God is not logically contradictory, then therefore he must exist in at least one world, or he or she or it, or however you want to describe it, must exist in at least one possible world. Well, it's also not contradictory for there to be no God.
Yeah, doesn't that make me correct?
Yeah, so by your reasoning, Jackie, then if it's not logically contradictory for God not to exist, then there must be at least one possible world where God does not exist. And if that's the case, and if God is defined as a necessary being, and there's at least one possible world without a God, then all possible worlds must not have a God. Do you see how that argument cuts both ways? Do you think an argument that cuts both ways like that is a good approach to an argument?
Yeah, I mean, if it cuts both ways like that, then you'd have a contradiction.
Right. So if you have a methodology that leads you to a contradiction, what does that tell you about that methodology?
I see. So perhaps the modal logic, or the concept of possible worlds and necessary beings, it's a flawed concept philosophically.
Yeah. Yep. I would say.
So what that means is you've got some work to do.
Yeah. We're back to square one, because that means even if there's 150,000 planes, I can say God does not exist on this one. There's a potential he doesn't exist on this one. Therefore, I'm correct. And you can say the same thing. You could say there's a potential God exists on this one. Therefore, he's correct. And we're back to square one, where I'm saying nope, and you're saying yeah. And then we have just a bunch of different planes to argue about that on. But to answer your question from the very beginning, no, I don't agree with that. I don't think it holds any weight or any water because of a multitude of reasons. But the main one being, if that is correct, that means I am also correct, and we can't both be correct at the same time.
Okay. Yeah, I'll have to look more into it. But it was nice talking to you guys.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jackie. I appreciate your call.
Appreciate you.